goblins and fiends and whatever. I mean, we're recording this right before Halloween, so, all sorts of ghouls and goblins and whatever else. Welcome to, we're up to episode 9 of season 13 here on Mention and Dispatches, and we appreciate all of our audience members sticking with us through all of this. Every season, we, take a turn with at least one, usually 2 or 3 podcasts as we can fit them in, where we spend a little bit of time addressing Wargaming's crossover with the professional and practitioner realm. So the folks that do this for a living in some form or fashion. And so tonight, we've got a couple of those folks that we've not had on Mention and Dispatches before. If you've been to some of our convention events, whether it's Fall Assembly or Origins, pre-pandemic, you've run across some of these folks. And if you're active on social media, you've definitely run across both of these guys talking about their professional wargaming lives. And so not so recently anymore, retired Marine Corps Major Ian Brown is here with us. Ian is the designer of the Maneuver Warfare card game and probably a lot of other stuff he's not really allowed to talk about. But Ian, it's not as recently retired anymore at this point, is it?
Yeah, I've been saying more that I'm like recently-ish retired, since it has been over a year, and the shine has come off, or I don't know how to say it, but I'm no longer not recently retired. It's further in my back window than I sort of like to think about, actually. But yeah.
You can, if you ever see Ian, you can tell he's now a retired Marine because there actually is hair on the side of his head.
Yes.
Well, I do have to comment that I am very disappointed not to see a ponytail or facial hair on you, Ian.
I know that's the sort of the check in the box that recent retiree veterans have to do, but I've actually never really liked having lots of hair. I actually shaved my head as close as I possibly could because I just liked how it was just so much easier to take care of. And it's interesting because one of my brothers had a ponytail in high school, which kind of turned me off ponytails. And then I had a cousin who retired out of the Navy, and he went like full vet bro, like bushy beard, down to his lower clavicle, and I was like, I do not want to look like that. I'm sorry. It did
the full wizard beard going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also noticed that you don't have the thank me for my service cap.
Yeah.
No, that's up in my closet, so don't worry. I got one of those.
Yeah, as is mine.
I didn't know if the spousal control unit had weighed in on the lack of facial hair. So
he doesn't like it either. So we're in a good place right now.
We're in alignment there. All right.
Yeah.
And the other voice that you're hearing creeping into the conversation there, from out in Kansas, our buddy Mike Dunn is here. Howdy, Mike.
Howdy.
Mike, I'm a little hesitant to ask, but still, how long ago did you retire?
Oh, good Lord. It's been over a decade at this point.
I was going to say, I knew you had, and it wasn't that recent, but I wasn't sure how recent.
I've been a longtime member in good standing of the Retired Field Grade Workfare program here at Fort Leavenworth.
I was going to say, I figured the year started with a 2, but
yeah. Let's put it this way. We have a whole generation of my student officers that have been wearing a uniform that I never had to wear.
Yes. Yeah. There are now colonels retiring at 30 that were commissioned after my year group. So that's
Yes.
always an interesting marker as you progress through your post-military life. So as mentioned, we brought both of these guys in because they've got some practitioner and pro experience, both from their time, wearing those funky tree suits, as well as their post-military lives. And look, we're not going to talk specifically about the offices and organizations they work in because that's not who they're here officially representing. We brought them in because they've got a lot of experience doing this kind of wargaming stuff. So we just wanted them here to kind of offer their thoughts and ideas and perspectives as they've seen things. And one of the key starting points in all of this is the idea that lots of hobbyists have played all kinds of war games, and hobbyists will talk about something being more realistic than the other or more detailed, or this is more of a simulation than a game, or whatever verbiage you want to use. But a lot of those hobby games have been picked up by the pros for a variety of teaching purposes in the different lessons that they work on, whether it's training a specific skill or a new way to present a concept or a new way to learn about a type of topic. And so with that as a starting point, Mike, I'm going to throw it to you first. What are some examples that you can think of, 1 or 2 particular hobby games that you guys have seen and used to good success in particular facets of introducing things to those military audiences that you've dealt with?
Oh, yeah, that's actually a great question, Brant. And there's actually a whole host of them that we have, well, shamefully stolen from.
It's research. It's research.
It's research. I tell you, it's research. It's an homage to that great game design. What we've seen with the global war of terror finally winding down, and has the Army has turned its attention back to large-scale combat operations, and multi-domain operations is all the rage these days, is all that is old is new again. There is literally a plethora of Cold War turned hot games from the 70s and the 80s that have gotten a new lease on life. I'm looking at my copy of Air and Armor, that wonderful game that Bruce Maxwell recently re-released with one of the best rule books I've seen in a long time, as well as a reimplementation of NATO Division Commander that Fabrizio Vianello out at Thin Red Line Games has done an amazing job of reintroducing to us. These really get at the heart of how do we train for the big fights, and how do we educate our leaders and how they're supposed to unfold. So yeah, it's been a absolute renaissance in that genre.
Yeah. No, that's great. And over on your side, from the Marine side rather than the Army side, what's a hobby game or two? You can't count Littoral Commander. Sebastian built that for educational purposes.
Here's my whole answer.
Well, look, he built that with the intention of providing a hobby-like game to train Marines and other military professionals. The intent was always to be a military training tool. So no, that one doesn't really count, even though it's been perfectly serviceable as a hobby game. What else you got in the tool bag there?
Yeah, no, it's okay. There's other things we can talk about here besides building up Sebastian's ego.
God help us.
So, but before I begin, I just want to make sure I throw out my usual disclaimer, which is my views are my own and don't represent any entity with which I'm affiliated, U.S. government, private, civilian, what have you, or otherwise, because I have a whole mess of various side hustles outside of my day job. So I just want to make sure I get that out there. But in terms of sort of the hobbyist stuff that the Marine Corps has been using, just as a little bit of background, before I grew all this luxurious mane of hair that I have, my last job in the Marine Corps was at the Baruch Kulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare at Marine Corps University here in Quantico, Virginia, and that was easily the best job I had in the Marine Corps outside of a flying squadron. And it was a really unique time to be there because shortly after I got there, it was when wargaming sort of became, as Mike sort of talked about, there was a renaissance in the Marine Corps, and it was directed from on high on down. Wargaming was a big part of the previous Commandant General Berger's planning guidance, which for those not familiar is like, hey, I'm the new Commandant. These are my big ideas for the Marine Corps while I'm here. I did a word count actually when he published it, and as a discrete subject, wargaming had more words devoted to it than any other discrete subject in that document. So it seemed pretty important to him. So part of my what I sort of under my director, but I also took on it myself a little bit, was, all right, Commandant wants us to do more wargaming. How do we do that here at Marine Corps University? And leveraging hobby games was the best and fastest way to do that, rather than waiting for somebody else to build something, like Sebastian, right? Yeah. Build something unique for the Marine Corps, because we've all seen, like, when the government builds something, it takes time, to put it generously. And I sort of, knowing past history of wargaming in the Marine Corps, time was something we didn't have. We needed to make it stick now as soon as possible. So among the sort of the hobbyist stuff we used there was a combination of tabletop and digital. On the tabletop side, okay, I can't talk about Littoral Commander, but I used it a lot. In fact, it was arguably the one I used the most because it had direct applicability to force design, to emerging threats for the Marine Corps. So I used it a lot, and I may have a box of custom made sets in my basement because I built multiple copies so that we could run run dozens of students through it at the same time because there was nothing else like it that directly touched on current relevant Marine Corps topics. However, we used other things as a something we did at the Krulak Center, sort of as an intro to this new wargaming thing the Commandant wants you to do, was trying to find sort of intro level war games that we could expose people to, how mechanics in the genre sort of work. So the tabletop game Friedrich was one I used a ton for as an introductory war game. Those not familiar, it's a 3 to 4 player game about the 7 Years' War, Friedrich against the world. It's great because it's got only 2 types of pieces. Logistics are very abstracted. However, there's a lot of really interesting decisions to include hidden information as well as protecting logistics, because if you don't do that, you will fail badly in Friedrich, that I really liked. Shores of Tripoli was another commercial one as an introductory war game. On the computer side, there were, we used Flashpoint campaigns, Command Modern Operations, which sort of, there's other stuff we could talk about later, maybe with Command Professional Edition. We used Operational Art of War for a couple of the schools, using the scenario editor to adapt stuff. And then this was sort of part of my effort at the Krulak Center, but I also want to give credit to those at Marine Corps University who were already doing wargaming in professional military education. And that includes Dr. Benjamin Jensen, who he's a big fan of Command. He's used that a ton. He's a professor at School of Advanced Warfare. And then Dr. James Lacey at the Marine Corps War College uses a plethora of tabletop commercial games going from the Peloponnesian Wars, through World War I, World War II, and into sort of the Next War series to demonstrate strategic thinking to the War College players who are there. So that's not an exhaustive list by any means, but those are sort of the go-to ones that we used.
I want to circle back around to the computer ones a little later, just because I've got some particular questions for you guys about those based on some of the research I did when I was in grad school. But on the tabletop side, through the Army's military decision-making process and then the Marine Corps planning process, there's that step in there of, wargame the various courses of action as a part of your course of action comparison. And I think for probably a lot of the folks that you encounter in uniform, certainly was true all the years that I was in, and Mike, probably all the years you were actually serving. That was the extent of kind of the wargaming experience folks had, unless they got roped into something like a Janus exercise or spent some time in the SimNet with the tank simulators or something. That MDMP wargaming was really the extent of what you got, and that's very directed for a very specific purpose. So in terms of kind of when you're telling folks, hey, we're gonna do some wargaming and we're going to learn about some of this, Mike, how much did you have to help people unlearn MDMP specific types of wargaming in order to start to kind of refill the knowledge bucket with other things? Or was that MDMP wargaming a sufficient basis to build off of to go in another direction with the hobby stuff?
Well, first of all, there was a lot that I had to have folks unlearn, as well as readjust attitudes. One of the things about military course of action analysis wargaming is that it is done so poorly. And that's a subject for a whole nother podcast about that. But so most of professional officers that have done co-analysis wargaming, well, they've got pretty significant scar tissue over it. It's pretty much one of those things that will trigger them to start getting the little eye twitch and the sweats and start diving underneath desk to assume the fetal position to make the bad memories go away. And that's what I have to tell folks, is that co-analysis wargaming is just one form of wargaming. There is a far broader approach to it that if you actually get to see it and see it done well, it actually is a lot of fun. I actually joined the Army because of wargaming, not the co-analysis, but because of the commercial hobby games. In fact, it's because of the Marine Corps that I did this. When I was a kid, I lived outside Quantico, where all my neighbors' dads were Marine Corps lieutenant colonels and majors, and they were all avid war gamers. I'd go see my friends' houses, and I'm thinking, oh, that looks really cool. What is that? The old school Hex and Counter style games, and of course the tabletop miniature games, which I still, after 40 years plus, absolutely love doing. But it's unfortunately within the profession of arms, it's not quite as well known. And unfortunately, that tends to be the very narrow focus that when military professionals hear the term war game, they automatically default back to the really horrid experiences they've had with course of action analysis wargaming. So we have to show them that there is other ways.
Yeah. I imagine if nothing else, the outputs are drastically different. So that becomes an issue there. So,
absolutely.
Ian, I'm not as familiar with the Marine Corps planning process. I know there is significant overlap with the MD&P that the Army uses, and there is some, that course of action analysis comparison wargaming in there. Talk to us a little bit about sort of where some of that overlap happened and kind of how useful, or the opposite, sort of how counterproductive it might have been using that as a reference point for folks.
Sure. And I want to first caveat this is sort of J-Lo's personal opinion and experience, which does not represent, the entirety of the Marine Corps here. And I say J-Lo because that was my call sign in aviation, and the aviation world in the Marine Corps is its own unique subculture, which, may or may not explain why there's some things I just sort of didn't encounter during my time in uniform. But I think there were, when I was sort of learning how to do this stuff at Marine Corps University, there were some sort of, I guess, warning orders or be prepared tos from some of the war gamers who were already there, sort of saying, hey, some people are going to come and say they've done COA Dev wargaming, which means they think they've done wargaming and they're going to act like they know what they're doing, and they don't. However, my experience was not so much like that adversarial, like I've done COA development wargaming on a staff, ergo I know what wargaming is. But I think the Marine Corps step in that process, it may have wargaming sort of in the title or job description, but it's not treated in the sense of something that you would sort of consider a game. I think it's more looked at as red teaming, or it's an adversarial look at a plan or plans that have been developed. But at least again, I had relatively limited staff experience. I spent some time on the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing staff. And then I was also on battalion staff as a forward air controller for an infantry battalion. But in the orders development process there, like I don't recall that we sort of took like the 3 different COAs, right? COA A, COA B, and the throwaway COA, and put them into a simulator or some sort of other game framework to run through it to see, how it would do. It was more that you could call it maybe more of a matrix style, or even like a bogsat, right? Just if I were red, sort of how would I poke holes in this particular plan? And that was that step of the planning process. So I think in some ways at Marine Corps University that I didn't have to fight through sort of that sort of adversarial perspective of, well, I've done COA wargaming, ergo I've done wargaming. I would say a lot of it was more like a blank slate, like people coming in saying they like what we on the screen here, what we would consider wargaming, they had not done that. So they were more, I guess, maybe open to sort of exposure, of what wargaming looks like and what it could do. So they weren't adversarial. They were they were not informed, or they were indifferent. And I can work with indifference. I can build on that, right? I'd rather actually work on that and make you a convert starting sort of from a middle baseline than be adversarial and have to fight through you to get you to sort of see what I think the value of it is.
Yeah. And I mean that course of action analysis wargaming is more of an analytical product than anything else. That it's not always necessarily to win, it's to gather the information you need to compare those courses of action. So it would make sense that it's not just a wargaming, what hobbyists would conceive of as a wargaming thing. It's just I was curious how, if at all, that served as a reference point for the military folks that you were working with in wargaming. And it sounds like Mike, you had some significant prejudices to overcome, whereas Ian, you kind of got lucky and it wasn't as relevant to the people you were working with, but partly because of your experiences with it, not necessarily because of the process itself. So,
I agree with that.
as we roll forward, so now we've got a war game on a table in front of some military folks. They've mastered enough, of the substance of the game to be able to accurately sort of push things around on the map and not break the rules of the game. They sort of understand the general concept we're after. How do we go from, hey, we're playing this game and I'm trying to kick your butt, to an actual lesson that we're learning from what's going on in the game that can be applicable somewhere in their military career, their next job, the broader lessons you're trying to learn? Ian, I'm going to throw it to you first this time, but as you've got that game on the table in front of the players, what's an example of some sort of lesson that was picked up from a particular game where you could either see the light bulb go on, or maybe it was just an accidental, oh yeah, that happened to work out kind of thing, that was a good lesson that was learned from one of those hobby war games that had some military application.
Sure. Am I allowed to talk about Littoral Commander now? Or do
yes.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I want to talk about Littoral Commander, not because I'm trying to boost Sebastian's sales, but because before it was Littoral Commander, it was called something else. And
look, they're not listening. We can call it Fleet Marine Force. The Marines
okay,
are not listening to this, right? Sebastian probably stopped listening in the first 5 minutes when I told him, when I told you couldn't use it as an example. So
yeah, no, he probably did. So Fleet Marine Force or Littoral Commander, whatever you want to call it, I genuinely used it as a go-to war game for Marine Corps specific audiences because of its timeliness, its relevance, and because you could argue whether or not it's truly like a beginner war game or not. My definition of beginner war game is, as I've discovered over the years, is different from other people's. But its core mechanics are straightforward enough that it's pretty easy to understand. Like, you've got 4 things you can do in a turn. You make combinations of the 4, and that's about it. But if I had a Marine Corps audience or a partner military or allied military audience, that was the game I put on the table because of its obvious immediate relevance to current issues. So in terms of like capturing those lessons is like one once the players kind of understood the gameplay, it was always great to see when they transitioned from trying to understand the game to trying to understand the strategy to defeat their opponents. And I have some wonderful memories, to include a time when a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant like jumped in the air and did a 360 spin before coming back down because his missile salvo had just like schwacked his opponent and like utterly annihilated the targets. That's a lesson. That's something that Marine definitely remembered walking away from that game. But something that we always did running iterations of Littoral Commander, and I'm sure Mike has done the same thing in the Army classes, is you immediately talk about after what they did and why they did it. So I kind of took from sort of my aviation background. Like, when we do a debrief, it's like you go through your plan, your brief, your execution. We sort of, for the war game, maybe you sort of skip the briefing step because there's no formal brief, but there's a plan you talk about with your teammates beforehand, and then there's the execution of the plan. And so I would always ask, what was your going in position? What cards, right? Littoral Commander has lots of cards to represent capabilities, munitions, assets that are not directly on the table as counters, but which you can call upon to support your achieving your objectives. So like, all right, what cards did you pick? Why did you pick those? Well, do you regret what you picked? You picked other stuff. Why would you have picked other stuff, right? If you went really heavy into ISR and very light on fires, did that pay off for you, or do you wish that you'd had more fires capabilities pulled into you? And then we would walk through both teams, like red team, blue team. Okay, how did you try and execute your plan? What problems did you run into? How did you adapt, or did you fail to adapt? Did your opponent outplan you, out execute you? And so what would you have done in execution differently based on that? And the time that we had to be able to devote to that, it would vary depending on the class and the structure, what have you. But whether you had 15 minutes or an hour to do that after action, I always wanted to do that so that we, once we got away from the, my missile schwacked you, so I'm going to be talking smack to you as we walk out of the classroom. Beyond that, what military lessons did you take away? And we would always talk about that. And if we had the time, I would also try and encourage some discussion on, okay, do you see the value of the war game you just did, of doing wargaming as a professional development tool? Do you think this is something you would take back to your unit? And then if they said yes, I would give them my email so they could ask me more questions about games to use when they got back to the fleet. But that was sort of how I did it there.
Mike, what about about you? You know, some tabletop game where some light bulb went on, and there was a great lesson learned there.
Oh, but pretty much every game that we play. I know that this is going to come as a real shock to you guys and your listeners, but military officers tend to be very competitive. Yeah, I know. That's a shock to everybody, right? So we actually are able to harness that competitiveness in the name of learning. And so it's not a bad thing that these guys are trying to basically embarrass and humiliate their lifelong friends in a professional setting because, well, it's fun to do that. But one of the ironclad rules that my colleague, James Sterrett, who I know is no stranger to the folks of this podcast, and I, is that we never play a game to completion. And the reason for that is the post-game hot wash. The analysis of what happened is that if you just lost a game, that your peer had basically just humiliated you, well, you're going to disengage because clearly this game sucks and the game was rigged and I've got nothing to learn. Whereas if you are the guy that basically really did deal out the smackdown, well, clearly you're Napoleon reincarnate. So you've got nothing to learn and you disengage from the discussion. So we always index while the game can go either way. We know that we have had a very successful game experience is that when we do say index, a collective groan goes up going like, no, we want to keep going. And one of the other things that we will do is that we'll have them take a 5-10 minute break and we'll come back and we'll discuss it. Almost 90% of the time, even though we've given them a 5-10 minute break, they are still at the table talking about the game, which is a wonderful experience. And we love to work on that. And I actually fully expect that. And I actually am disappointed if somebody actually walks out of the room to do take their break. But they understand people have got biological needs that need to be met. So, okay, I'll let it slide. But then we come back, and as J-Lo pointed out, it's not so much the gameplay itself, it's the making the meaning of what just happened that's really important. And that's actually one of my favorite questions is, hey, what did you learn today that you didn't know before? What sort of new view do you have on things? And the other question I always love to ask is, what would you do differently? And why would you do it differently? And depending on the context of the class I'm running, sometimes I'll ask, what is it about the game that you would change? What is it about the model that we just went through? Do you think was inaccurate and what needs to change and how would you change it? And that also uncorks a lot of really fantastic discussion when people start putting on their military professional of arms hat, thinking, I could see how we could make this change and how that would improve, quote unquote, the gameplay experience. The key there is to get them talking and thinking about what just happened.
Yeah, improve with the air quotes around it, right? Because
absolutely.
Improving in one facet usually, detracts somewhere else because there's only so many things you can do with any given game. So.
Yeah, the example of that is the wonderful introductory war game that GDW, Frank Chadwick, had designed 38 years ago as an introductory freebie game, Battle for Moscow.
Yeah.
And I will go around the room and say, hey, what game mechanic would you change or add to it? And invariably, they would all add a whole bunch of things that make a lot of sense. And after I do that, I point to Thunder in the East, the Battle for Moscow all grown up, where I show them that, hey, this 4-page pamphlet, which are the rules, has now expanded to a 90-page rule book. And everything you just mentioned is in this game. Anybody want to go take it for a spin? More often than not, I love it. It's one of my favorite games out there. I'm a huge fan of the European Theater of Operations series that Chadwick and company are working on. But then again, I've been doing this for many decades, so my threshold for pain is much higher.
Yeah, at a certain point, the cognitive dissonance kicks in, right? This isn't pain. We're having fun. I spent all the time learning this. It must be for fun.
Absolutely. We're looking at you, Advanced Squad Leader crowd.
Yes. So, Ian, I don't know that we'll get to it on this on this broadcast, but at some point, I really want to hear the story behind J-Lo as the call sign. There's always a good story behind every call sign. So.
No. The tradition is it has to involve an adult beverage before you get the story.
That's why I said we're not going to do it on this.
I'm already there, so
I'm only like 2/3 of the way through a Diet Dr. Pepper, so I'm not sauced up enough to really appreciate the story. But it's not like I'm not ever going to see you at another convention or anything. So we'll have an opportunity to do this down the line.
You'll get the story. And I would like to make clear for the audience, there's two ways you get call signs. You do something very memorable, or you do something dumb and stupid. Mine was memorable. It wasn't for being dumb and stupid. And I will take being memorable any day of the week over being dumb and stupid.
All right, so we're a half an hour into this, and we have not yet let Ian plug Maneuver Warfare. So we need to take a turn here into, all right, so as you're looking at the universe of things that are available for Marines to play some war games, to have an opportunity to use these, to learn some lessons, to do some training, to do some what, you clearly identified a gap in there somewhere and said, hey, I can do something that fits this niche in a game I can put in front of Marines to give them an opportunity to do some wargaming, to expand their critical thinking skills, their analysis skills, their warfighting skills, their whatever skills it was that you were after there. Talk to us a little bit about where Maneuver Warfare came from, what was the gap you were looking to fill with it, and a little bit about the evolution of how you went from the original idea to where you are now with it actually filling that gap.
Sure. So along the way here, I am going to blame Sebastian because I blame him for a lot of things. And, my attempts at game design are no exception. But for those in the audience, actually, there's a much longer version of the story, which you can find as a Marine Corps Gazette article, which the Dietz Foundation kindly put on their webpage. If you want a link to that, I can easily send you the link. So I'm not. I'm not.
Or we just have it linked to this episode of the podcast, like they can just scroll down and click.
I can easily give you that. So I'm not going to try and regurgitate my essay, but a couple points in the origin story. This was actually my second attempt to develop a card-based or a completely card-based war game. My first attempt was it was shortly after I got to the Krulak Center, and within the first 6 months, I think a new Marine Corps doctrinal publication dropped. It was called Competing, and it was sort of like like a good wine and cheese. Like Competing paired very nicely with Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, which talks about maneuver warfare as the Corps' ultimate warfighting philosophy. And I found the stuff in Competing really interesting because DoD has talked a lot about competition versus conflict. We're in the competition phase right now, which means we are seeking to gain advantage and create disadvantages for prospective adversaries without shooting missiles at them, basically. And how we do that can cross the, anyone who's familiar with the DIME spectrum, right? There's the diplomatic, informational, military, economic. I believe they've added some letters to it in recent years, and I don't know what they are, but like the core point of the DIME construct was you're tussling with your adversary in more than just the military sense. And so I thought, hey, wouldn't it be, we got this brand new doctrinal pub, wouldn't it be cool if you had like a game where you could compete rather than fight, and you would have like different objectives based on the D, the I, and the E. And I made some prototypes, and I was trying to figure out how to gamify this doctrine, and I just didn't have the skills to do it at that point. Like I said, I was early on, and when I got to MCU, Littoral Commander did not yet exist, and I just kind of I stalled out and sort of put it on the shelf. And then Littoral Commander came out, and I started using it extensively, but two, once I got familiar with like the basic rule set, I started getting requests from different entities within the university and outside of it. Hey, could we do a scenario that does X, right? That's outside of like the core scenarios in Littoral Commander. And so I started experimenting, with initially simple scenario design, but then as some of them, as more complex requests came in, that's when I really started challenging myself to see how far I could push the game engine of Littoral Commander without breaking it. And that meant creating new factions, outside of the red and the blue, new factions that didn't exist in the game, creating new mechanics to support those factions, figuring out how to do sort of asymmetric things that didn't violate the core rules, but really presented some challenging problems. If you were a conventional player fighting against an unconventional asymmetric adversary, it would force you to look differently at how you would employ conventional forces. So shifting to that gave me much more confidence once I'd done that for a couple of years of, okay, I've done this. I've seen what's available to the Marines now in terms of wargaming. We're trying to push wargaming out to the fleet more as a professional development tool. Sebastian is building copies of Littoral Commander on his kitchen table and mailing them literally across the world, so individual Marine units can go play. This is all great stuff. However, the thing with a lot of tabletop games is they have a lot of stuff that goes with them. Pieces, right? You need a map. You got to put counters on the map. You need dice. Some of them are card based, like the Toro Commander or Swords of Tripoli. You have a lot of different things in the table. And I was thinking back to, all my operational deployments, and I'm like, guys who were overseas, like, especially like if you're on a ship or you're in some, crappy, plywood built building, you don't have room for all of this stuff. So I started thinking of, is there a way we could give Marines a war game that's got like the crunchiness of one of those rich war games that has lots of stuff. It has, deep rule sets, lots of different player options. But how could I put it in a package where if I'm sitting in like, a tiny little wardroom on one of the smaller amphibs, I could put that game on the table and I would not need more than that table and a light source to be able to play. And so this drove me back to the deck construction genre of game, which is something I played in my younger days in high school, specifically the Star Wars card game that Decipher, the company, put out. I'm not going to tell you how many thousands of cards I bought for that game, but I really love that game because there's so many different infinite combinations of just the cards. And so as I was thinking of like the problem, how do you make a rich, crunchy war game for Marines who may only have like a 4x8 table available to them? I thought back to the Star Wars card game. I'm like, this has a lot of stuff that has like military applicability to it, that with all my experience now and in working on scenarios and understanding game mechanics to teach them to other people, on reflection, this is a really good style of game to put in players, because deck construction is all about force design and task force organization and optimization, where you are making assumptions on what your opponent is going to bring to the table. You have to hedge against those assumptions. You have to decide what your own bid for victory is going to be. And you have a very limited constraint on the deck size on how you do all of that. So you can't bring everything. You have to make hard choices about your task force, your hedging, and your bid for victory. So I looked at the deck construction option as a game to the point of purity, where you only have one component, and you don't need a lot of space to play it. And oh, by the way, everything you need to play the game as either the red or the blue player, you can put in a box of 60 cards and shove in your cargo pocket. And every Marine has a cargo pocket, or 3 or 5, right? So that keeping
just
to
the
that
question of what else
factor,
is in them.
Yes, you got dip and cigarettes and maybe a Rip It half can that's in there too. But a poker deck of cards, man, in a cargo pocket's actually roomy to put that. So that form factor was a key part of the game design. And then at that point, I built enough confidence to start experimenting with game mechanics, figuring out how to sort of include dice and random number generators built into the cards. I took Marine Corps Maneuver Warfare Doctrine as sort of the underlying thread that wove through it. So my abortive attempts to gamify competing finally came to fruition because I learned enough to figure out how to gamify doctrine in the maneuver warfare sense. Sometimes it was a mechanic, sometimes it was literally like taking a card straight out of the doctrinal publication. And in the last 2 years, it's been a lot of refinement to polish off the edges. But that's how the game came to be. Mike mentioned Jim Sterrett there a little while ago. Brant, you were there at Origins this summer, where I had a highly emotional moment with Jim Sterrett and Tom Velot when they played my game. And like I'd showed Jim Sterrett a much earlier prototype when I came to the Wargaming 101 course at Leavenworth. He didn't really get a chance to play it, but I showed it, and then he actually got to play it at Origins. And I got a 3-hour wire brush debrief from those two guys afterwards, and included some feedback that would require me to break apart a piece of my game that had been coupled tightly from the very beginning. And I really didn't want to do that because the Dietz Foundation had already picked it up for publication. And as far as I was concerned, the game design was stable. And at this point, I was just like, do you like the font? Do you like the colors? That was the level of playtesting I was doing. So when he told me that, I had a very sleepless night trying to figure, like, one, do I want to do this? And my little voice inside was, if Jim Sterrett says you should do it, you should probably do it. And then trying to figure out how to do that without going back to the drawing board. Fortunately, Jim had some thoughts on that, so I did not have to break my game again, which was great. And in fact, I was very excited because his feedback I rapidly prototyped and then put into a new version that I used at Connections like a week later to try it out. And it worked very well and actually captured the maneuver warfare doctrine better than I'd already done it.
See, folks, this is why you want to come to Origins, so you can get your game designs refined and or broken and shredded.
Yeah, we call that shooting your puppy, named after Old Yeller, where you've got this adorable family pet that you are really, really attached to. But there comes a point where you just need to take it out back behind the barn and, well, put it down because, well, reasons.
Yeah. Oh, I like in the stuff that I've written, I've had editors who have murdered my darlings with zero compassion, and so I was like used to that with my writing, but this is the first time I'd really had that moment in game design, and it was such a striking moment. Brant, I wrote for you later on,
yes,
on the website. This is why you playtest, but also do not ever get the hubris that your game is done and is beyond feedback and improvement, even at the 11th hour, because you might come across somebody like Jim Sterrett who has a really fantastic bit of feedback that will actually make your game closer to what you wanted it to be at its core, but you have to be open to listening to that.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of lessons to be taken from there. One, the one you just mentioned, one of the most important ones is don't get too attached to what you've got, because, things, you never know when the bolt from the blue is going to hit and make things better. The second one is the off-made joke of games are never completed; they're just released. There's always something you can do to it.
Extraordinarily true.
Yeah, but then there's also two other things, and they sort of dovetail together. But the first one's probably the easy one, which is James Sterrett's probably smarter than just about anybody else you've had playtest your game. So feedback from him is going to be pretty damn meaningful and
brutal.
Yeah, and brutal. Because it's
he was very nice about it. He was very nice about the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, it's not that he's mean or anything. He's just very insightful and is going to ask you some questions they're sort of designed to make you uncomfortable. But the point is that you have to defend the decisions that you made, because if you've made sound decisions, then you should be able to defend them. But the second part of that, and Ian, this isn't intended to pick on anybody in particular as a part of your process, but you kind of have to, as a part of playtesting, you have to find some adversarial playtesters, and that's something that I don't think enough people do. And let's face it, like a lot of military audiences have no idea. They're great red teamers in terms of like a tactical sense. You can find some great people to be assholes as opponents within the game, but you have a harder time finding people to be more adversarial playtesters of, hey, well, why'd you make this decision? Well, why does this rule work this way? Well, why is this structured in this fashion? That as you're playtesting things, in order to really sharpen the design, you have to have people ask you those uncomfortable questions. James just happens to be very nice about it. but
the hell you say?
Nice.
Well,
nice,
he has been to me.
It was 3 hours of nice.
So Mike, he has been nice to me, but I also wasn't ever doing it for a grade in one of his classes. So there's that as a part of this.
And I joke. James and I have been great friends for well over a decade now. And I actually love working for him. And so, this is all part of the slogging back and forth that we've had, or as I call it, the James and Mike comedy hour.
Yes. But it is true that, folks that don't have a ton of exposure to wargaming aren't always going to be great about asking those questions. They can play test some stuff and they may be able to bring some outside perspective as to, well, why did you do this? Well, why is this set up that way? Because there may be underlying conventions or assumptions within wargaming that they don't know enough about to even know that that's just kind of the way things are done. And so they're going to ask you some of those questions, but outside of the way things are done, they may not have enough insight into the game mechanics and the processes and such to really ask those uncomfortable questions. And that's where, the term term adversarial playtester sounds like you're trying to be mean to people, and that's not really the intent. But you've got to have somebody really ask those hard questions underlying your mechanics that say, okay, so why are you doing this? Well, what does this represent? Well, why are you making this certain thing a certain way? And that happened to me at an Origins one time myself, where I had Ian hasn't been around long enough to get the joke, but Mike probably has seen over the years the various jokes about, hey, Brant, when's Orange Crush finally going to get published? The answer at this point is never, because the actual war in Ukraine that's been going on for 2 years has completely overtaken what I had designed back in 2007. So, I mean, that's blown out of the water. It's never going to get published in its current form, but a lot of the rules system could get reused. But that was largely the result of two specific Origins where I got a little bit of the wire brush, again, politely, but people really digging in and asking some uncomfortable questions about, okay, so what does this represent? Why did you build this mechanic this way? Why do these units behave in this fashion? What are you trying to represent in doing this certain thing? And so having to defend those answers, you're either, or having to answer those questions and then defend those answers, you either show a conviction and belief in your system and to be able to explain its connective tissue back to reality somehow, or kind of shrug and go, well, I just made it up, and that's not a comfortable conversation to have.
The lucky 13th season of Mentioned in Dispatches is made possible by our fantastic regimental patrons, who joined our Patreon at the top level. The Armchair Dragoons would like to thank Michael Sundberg, Andy J., Fred Stogg, Joseph Knorr, Hellcat6, Chet Bell, Stagger Wing, Kevin Bertram, Patrick Garrity, Mike Quigley, and Fred too. Their support of the Regiment of Strategy Gaming helps us bring you the best strategy gaming article, events, and this podcast. You can join us as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons. Cheers!
You get into what we do in our Masters of Military Arts and Science in Wargaming program that we run at Leavenworth, is that we purposely are not trying to be mean, but we want people to, our students, to basically show us their logic. What's their reasoning behind why they went with a particular game mechanic or design philosophy. And that's what we're trying to elicit from our folks.
Yeah. And those are conversations you got to have as a part of that whole design process. So I am curious, as we're getting close to our hour mark. Like, once I edit out me saying as often as I tend to, like, I'll that'll easily save 10 minutes within the podcast. But I do want to pivot a little bit to some of that design stuff. And so, Mike, I know you've done a lot in the Kriegspiel world. You've seen a lot of designs come across your desk with student designs that are out there. When are we going to get a Mike Dunn design show up on our tables, be it just for fun at Origins or like actually something real that you're trying to push through production? I know you don't have a ton of time to deal with this around, like, grading papers and all that, but when are we going to see a Mike Dunn design hit the table, and what's it going to be?
Yeah, you are, sir, are assuming a level of self-discipline and commitment and unlaziness that I do not possess. No, I actually face a lot of the same issues that you run into with Orange Crush, is that I've got a great idea for a wonderful game, only to watch somebody else publish it later with a lot of the same design goals in mind. So looking at,
I just watched the war unfold completely differently than what I had built the game model around.
Yes.
That's what broke mine. Reality caught up with it.
And it keeps you nice and humble.
Yeah.
I have to say. No, I have such a great time working with my students and looking at their game designs and what goes into it. It's absolute joy to watch. So I get so caught up into what they're doing. And like most of us that are listening to this podcast, is that we will unbox a game, and the first thing that we'll go to is look at the sequence of play in the rule book. And the second thing we'll look at is the designer notes. And then we all have the same thought. What can I do to make this better? What can I change about this game design? Which, of course, makes game developers everywhere weep. It's like, no, we already did that work for you. Just shut up and play the game and enjoy.
They're never completed. They're only released.
This is true. This is why there's expansion modules.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, just ask the squad leader world about that.
Yeah.
And again, I do a lot of teasing squad leader out of love, because that was actually one of my first war games 40 some years ago. But it's game design as well, outpaced the basic design. So I understand. Yeah. Right. What was the original question? Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. Feel free to edit out the word salad.
Ian, is there something tentatively on the drawing board after Maneuver Warfare, now that is working its way through Dietz's pre-order process and going to go to press at some point soon?
There is a prototype. It's been sort of shelved for a few months because I've had other priorities, but I have a design with pieces that I've tested a couple times called it's called tentatively What the Beep Is That Thing, and it is based off of
brilliant.
It's a literal quote from, I forget if it was a Navy or Air Force fighter pilot, but from the sort of increased plethora of unidentified aerial phenomena sightings and recordings that military fighter pilots have seen over the recent years. This is kind of a jumping off thing of some research I did for a historical podcast, the Mother of Tanks podcast, for anyone who's familiar out there. Sorry, it's not Mother of Tanks. She's the one who runs it. It's the Why We Fight podcast.
Yeah.
And the podcast itself, it's right now it's focused on World War II, kind of like doing looks at year by year at a huge variety of subject matters. And she had approached myself and some other Marines, be like, hey, you want to get some Marine Corps content in here? And of course we were like, yeah. But
Marines talking about Marines, whoever saw such a thing coming?
Yeah. Never happens.
Unthinkable.
But I wanted to try and do something a little unconventional, just from doing another battle study. And so with the UAP stuff going on, I was like, hey, let's go revisit the Foo Fighter phenomenon from the end of World War II.
Not the band, people. Not the band.
Yes, not the band. But a real and well documented phenomenon of some bizarre luminescent things that were observed by primarily in the European theater, but also less frequently in the Pacific theater, but by American night fighter squadrons over France and Germany. And my podcast did not attempt to answer the question of what they were, but it's just interesting that you had these night fighter guys back in the day who some critics of the phenomenon sort of dogged the night fighter guys for they didn't recognize ball lightning, or they might have been hungover, or they couldn't discriminate rocket flares from something else. And part of my research was, hey, these night fighter guys were actually probably the best of the best when it came to aviators. So if they couldn't explain something, and they knew the difference between a rocket and ball lightning, but they couldn't explain it. And we fast forward to today, right, where we have aircraft with much more advanced sensors. We have much more advanced training regimens for our pilots, and we're still seeing, can I swear on this program, Brent?
Yeah. I mean,
all right, we're seeing shit that we don't understand. And it's stuff that you can see on multi-spectrum sensors doing weird shit in the air. And with all of our multi-billion-dollar avionics and sensors and technology and training, we still don't know what some of these things are. So that was my jumping off point. And what the beep is that thing is from an actual flight recorder transcript of I think it was a Navy pilot seeing this weird thing through his sensors. But the game itself is you've got the human player and the UAP player, and in some ways it's almost it's an RPG like type thing, because you have certain points where you can use to customize your aircraft and your sensors, and you can request external assets as the human player, from ship-based radars, air traffic control radars, airborne signals intelligence aircraft. And for the human player, you're doing sensor fusion to detect enough of the performance of the UAP to be able to develop a warhead that can shoot it down, so you can look at it, right? On the UAP player side, I'm not calling it alien or something else. You're the UFO. You can customize your aircraft in terms of its detectability across different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, as well as its agility, its ability to shift altitude blocks, its speed and how fast it can go per any given turn. And you're essentially trying to run out the clock and evade the sensor fusion to the point where the human player can shoot you down. I have a rough prototype. It needs a lot more work but that's the next thing in the chute.
Well, so not a war game. No, I'm kidding. We're not going down that rabbit hole. We've done that enough.
That sounds like a great game. I would love to.
I would call it a war game.
I'm just joking. That's always the look. It's kind of like when you're in off-season protocols in sports radio, right? When it's the summer and there ain't a whole lot going on. There's just a bunch of bad baseball teams playing each other, and so you trot out the old cliches of who's on your Mount Rushmore of fill in the blank, right? There's so if you're ever stuck for content in the wargaming world, you just start an argument about how would you define a war game? What's actually what is a real war game? And you can go for hours on that, and it's just like baked in content. I'd like to think that we've evolved a little beyond that here on this podcast, although others will certainly say absolutely not. So
yeah, it's amazing the fist fights that verbally break out over that. And
there are times when those sorts of definitions are necessary. Podcasts are rarely one of those times.
Yes. Strongly agree.
Yes. Before we circle back around to, I'd said I wanted to get back to one of the digital wargaming questions. I do want to just ask a broader question in terms of the players' not long-term exposure, but sort of the inculcation of wargaming amongst the people to whom you've exposed, with wargaming there. Not that you exposed yourself to people, but like getting some wargaming in front of them and whether or not it actually took hold. And those people kept not just some of the lessons that you taught, but the process of using war games for, finding some of those lessons, for practicing those reps and sets of decision making, and wargaming's utility as a tool for military development down the line. Ian, have you had much feedback 6 months, a year, 2 years, 4 years later from some of those folks that you've taught that yes, they're still using wargaming as a tool. Yes, it's still a regular thing in their kit bag that they pull out for use outside of its officially prescribed places like the planning processes? What, if any, success stories do you have, or is it turned into one of those, well, I did it because I had to, but now I don't have to, so I don't care?
So I think there are success stories out there, although again, I should caveat that my knowledge is anecdotal and I do not attempt to or presume, to represent what's going on across the Fleet Marine Force. But I think there are success stories. However, as looking back on sort of the earlier golden ages of wargaming in the military, they can happen on sort of unique islands of excellence. And the key thing that I think is still not there yet is not reinforcement. Like, we're not missing reinforcement from the top down, nor are we missing a grassroots appreciation, because there are Marines out there who do this on their own without any accolades or benefits because they think it's valuable. But it's really that middle range reinforcement as a tool to be used sort of at the command level. But there are, I can point to some success stories. If, for example, like, I'm going to talk about Littoral Commander again, because that actually has actual data that can point to it. But even before it was commercialized, like, Sebastian kept a tracker of who had requested copies and where, and so you could point to, hey, there's 3-4 dozen Marine units out there in the fleet that are doing wargaming right now, using Littoral Commander, and they're doing it not because the Commandant said so. Well, partly because the Commandant said so a little bit, but they're doing it because, thanks to the emphasis from the top down, it gave those at the units enough ammunition to say, hey, sir, can we go do this? And, oh, by the way, here's this tool that actually happens to talk about current and future problem sets for the Marine Corps. You don't have to pay for it, sir. We have the tool. Just kind of give us the time and the leeway to do it. So that has happened, right? And I, in some of the more schoolhouse level, I can point to, I relatively recently did a podcast, one of my other side gigs, podcast with War on the Rocks, talking with Gunnery Sergeant Chase McGroarty Hunter, who had successfully gotten Littoral Commander implemented in one of the enlisted professional military education courses, which I think from my perspective, Sebastian's perspective, and a lot of other perspectives, is a huge win, because it's great that the officers do it, but you know what? The officers are the minority in the Marine Corps. Most of the Marines are enlisted, and we're finally sort of getting into the enlisted educational curriculum to get them to do the same things that the officers are doing, which is valuable for many reasons, to include having a senior enlisted advisor who can speak the same, sort of language to the commander, and using wargaming as a connective tissue makes both of them better, makes that advice better, makes that commander's tactical decisions more sound. So it's great for a lot of reasons that it's happening. And we can point to additional sales of Littoral Commander because there's obviously a demand signal given that they're in the second printing and they got enough support to print actual wooden blocks, which is fantastic. And I can point to certain anecdotal interest in my own card game because I've sent prototype copies out to some Marine forces. In fact, I've got a current CO, Marine Wing Com Squadron 38. I hope I got his command right. Asked for a copy because he's standing up like kind of a wargaming professional development thing on his own. So it is getting out there. And there's other sources we could point to, like there was an article on the Maneuverist website either last year or the year before where an infantry some infantry officers at their battalion used the board game Memoir 44 and ran like a tournament type thing, but they also captured data to try and quantify like the decision-making patterns that they were detecting across their Marines. And nobody told them to do that. They just they wanted to do it and they got permission. So these things are happening, right? But I think the one thing that still needs to happen is that sort of middle range connective tissue where the commanders and sort of those at other parts of other parts of big Marine Corps that are not the commandant is sort of unifying those efforts together so that it becomes an expectation that, hey, units will do wargaming as professional development, not just COA wargaming, because that's limited to like the few times you do the Marine Corps planning process. And not just tied together, but given the additional support and resources that an institution can give to an effort, right? Because it should not be captains and majors buying their own copies out of their own pocket to do it. Institutional support will make the impact better, and it really doesn't cost a lot, even if the institution is doing it. What is it? I don't know, $70-$80 for Sebastian's game, right? In the bucket of DoD budget, buying copies of Littoral Commander is not a big ask. And I point to my card game, right? That's $30, right? That is, you spend more on like a good case of beer than you will on my card game. So it's not resource.
Yeah, but how many Marines are buying good cases of beer?
That's a different question.
Yeah, and I take issue with the fact that it's an either-or situation. I'm thinking game and beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, buy my $30 card game, get a crappy case of beer, right? It's not resource intensive.
Absolutely.
I know the answer is going to be a little different for you because the intent of some of your students there is to go off and go do wargaming as a part of their job. But
right.
Of the broader base of students that come through for whom that is not true, just the ones that are exposed to wargaming, like all the tweets Mark Greenwald keeps posting online, right? I can name him because we keep sharing them with Mark going, hey, look at all the stuff we're doing, and it's under Mark's name. This isn't secret stuff. Like Mark is openly posting his face in front of a bunch of majors playing games behind him. Of the ones for whom that is not the intent, right? To move off back into big army and go be wargamers somewhere. How much, if at all, have you seen wargaming as a tool, whether it's a professional development tool or just, a more informal learning sort of tool, take root with these folks taking it back to wherever their next assignment or 2 or 3 are, that wargaming continues to be used without being forced to be used?
Well, that's actually one of the good things about having a captive audience of our student base, where we will brutally and viciously force them to play a game because they have to for the culminating exercises that we put them through. Is that I literally every week I will get a former student doing reach back to us saying, hey, we'd like to do this for our professional development program, or hey, this was a lot of fun when we did this, but we also learned a lot doing it. What do you recommend? And so I am seeing our what we've called over the years our wargame insurgency warfare program really start to take root. We are starting to see that generation of officers that are really taking it to heart. It doesn't help that we have that generation of officers that are coming through our schoolhouse that playing Dungeons and Dragons or World of Warcraft was not an alien activity, that they actually do have an appreciation for digital games and console games, and they also are not all that adverse to playing a game of Magic the Gathering. So yeah, we're starting to see students essentially emerge from under the surface as being actual gamers.
That's kind of cool.
It really is.
Yeah.
Of course, when I do have that one student that when I will talk about some of the games, and the student that is not a gamer, they'll start tittering, going, he, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, ha, 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 ha. I will ask them, so have you actually ever played Dungeons and Dragons? I said, no, of course not. I was too cool for that. It's like, excellent. And I'll break out my set and I will go full uber game nerd on them, and I will force them to play Dungeons and Dragons. And I actually do have these LED light up dice that I like to go force them to roll because, just really reinforces the full nerdery of it. But they get the point that it's not just a bunch of adult nerds playing make-believe, that there actually is some crunchiness to it, that you actually do have to think through things. You actually do have to take a combined arms approach to your encounter, and that you do have to do some tactical thought to it.
Somewhere in all of this, somebody's got to take, basically fantasy football, fantasy baseball, and kind of reskin it with a military theme. So when folks give you crap about D&D, well, fine. Okay, so you think D&D is too weird. How about fantasy baseball? Only it's military units that you're trying to put together the ideal force to go do blah, blah, and blah. And let them be the GMs of a military force building your components to go fight whatever as a fantasy baseball game.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I love it, Brent. You should design that.
Yeah, because I don't have anything else to do, like, edit podcasts and stuff.
Or a day job.
Yeah, or a day job, or everybody loves Tuesday Newsday because nobody has to spend all the time compiling all that stuff, right? Everybody just goes, oh yeah, great, thanks for doing that. Yeah, there goes most of the day. So
no, it's heavy lifting work, and God bless you for doing it. As you said, I am far too lazy for that sort of activity. But now you'd asked earlier about what sort of games do we have in mind, and it's, as I see our students, there's always different things I would think of. Hey, it'd be really great if they had a game to reinforce this lesson. And one of the things that's been a bugaboo of mine over the years is a lack of understanding of battle space and battlefield geometry. If I see one more plan that has an artillery battalion occupying a position area for artillery that is 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, I'm going to lose it on a student. So one of the games that we were thinking about doing was designing something called Combat Tetris, where you basically have got the unit footprint of what a type of unit would take up. And, oh, by the way, go ahead and you've got all these different subunits that you got to arrange. So here's your space and make them all fit together. All right, Great job. You've done that. Now let's go ahead and put that big blob into motion. Great. Now let's go ahead and have somebody try to kill it.
Yeah.
Okay. Not an easy solution.
Yeah. Everybody always has that perfect laydown on the battlefield until suddenly you now have to displace for a mobile defense.
Yes.
Suddenly it's a little more complicated.
Yeah, but I am enthused to see folks within the profession of arms taking it a lot more seriously. This is how they learn how to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Last thing I want to, I promised very early on to circle back around to the digital piece, because just about everything we've talked about has been tabletop wargaming so far. Mm-hmm. However, both of y'all had mentioned some digital games earlier in the discussion. One of the ones that came up, Flashpoint campaigns. We are always going to ride hard for our guys from On Target Sims doing Flashpoint campaigns with Rob and Jim and Jeff and those guys, because they're all friends of ours, right? I mean, they've been a part of the Origins crew together, predating the Wargame HQ back when James Sterrett used to be a part of the team that did what's now the CPXs, the staff wargaming team up in the Origins War College, right? That was me and James and Jim Snyder and Mark Graves was there. And we would pull these things together and put on these staff exercises for everybody. There's video out there on YouTube of us doing some of these. But we're always going to ride hard for the Flashpoint campaigns, guys. You also mentioned Command Modern Ops. As we are recording this, there was actually an article over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal about Command Modern Ops.
Yes, I saw that.
which of course it's Wall Street Journal, right? So it's paywalled, which is a pain in the nuts, but I did have a friend send me a PDF of it. It's a good article. As we are a little more on the inside, there's obviously some things we will find in there to quibble with, but by and large, I thought it was a pretty solid, fair article about, using command for the different purposes they can use it. One of the issues that I found when I was working on my PhD in grad school, one of the things I was looking at was comparing interactive versus non-interactive learning conditions. And so the idea of having a game-based interaction where you could learn certain things versus the static slide-o-matic, just sort of flipping some things at you and picking stuff up to compare those learning conditions. One of the unintentional things that we found as a part of that research was that the interface made all the difference in the world in the learning, the level of learning exhibited by the participants. And really it boiled down to this, that if you had participants that were already largely familiar with the interface of the training tool as a whole, whether it's the game, whether it's the slide-o-matic, whether it's whatever you're putting in front of them, that they were better able to absorb the lessons you were trying to teach them, and they were better able to pay attention to the things you wanted them to learn from the game. Whereas if they didn't already understand the interface, they spent their time learning the interface, not learning the lessons you put in front of them. Now, the interface for PowerPoint's pretty simple, right? You hit the next slide button a bunch of times. You might have to back up once or twice, but it's really, it's kind of, left or right, and that's about it. Whereas if you're doing more of a video game kind of thing, are you doing the WASD to move around, or are you using a mouse or a joystick? And how do you look up? How do you look down? How do you maneuver through the world? And folks would end up folks that didn't already understand basic game interfaces like that spent more time trying to learn the interface than they were absorbing the lessons that were put in front of them. And I really think, Mike, you've seen this a ton. Ian, you've probably seen it a ton. This is why there is an entire jobs program outside of every Army base for retired majors to be pucksters for all of these exercises, because they know how to work CBS, they know how to work JCATS, they know which buttons to push to make what happen, so that the participants can just say, make that guy drive over there, and the guy running the computer makes it happen. They don't have to learn how to hit all the right buttons. As you're looking back at Flashpoint campaigns or Command Modern Ops, especially, God, it's a complicated interface because it has to be, right? It's complicated stuff you are doing, and they've simplified it really as much as they realistically can, given the nature of the complexity of what they're doing. But looking at some of those digital interfaces, and Mike, there's probably more to you, although Ian, let you chime in after Mike sounds off here. What have you seen in terms of learning the interface versus learning the lessons you want in front of them in the game? Does the research we found 10, 12 years ago, whatever, still hold up with what you're putting in front of students today?
Yeah, that is spot on. That's one of the reasons why I like doing what I call adjudicated gameplay, where I want my students to do their own planning and have somebody that's actually going to do the behind the scenes puckstering. I don't want to have my students have to learn the game when they could actually be spending time playing the game, if that makes sense. And I'd rather have them be making decisions about the military situation in front of them, instead of having to go like, okay, how do I make this unit do an attack, or how do I put it into defense mode? I'd rather have somebody else deal with that. One of the other things, and this goes a little bit further, why I prefer tabletop games over computer games, is that it's a black box. You may be piling on an attack or on a defense, and you may be getting an outcome that you have no idea why you got that outcome, because the model is hidden within the game, and you don't really have that understanding as to what just happened. Whereas if you're using a tabletop game, you have to work through the model, which basically means that you are seeing the assumptions baked into the model, which also is another way of saying that if you don't like the model, well, you can go ahead and change it. In a computer game, yeah, not so much, unless you're willing to give somebody a big sack of cash and several months to go in there and change that model. You're going to have to live with what you're given. But
I've heard this before.
yes, you have. That said, though, there are times when a computer game is the way to go, and that is if you aren't really worried about the outcome of what you got, but more of the process that you use to make those decisions, then yes, by all means, use a computer game. And that's one of the art of computer game design is how do you make a user interface that actually allows you to look at the information that you need to make a decision and allows you to input that your decision and see the outcome of that decision. Yeah. Whether or not it's a in-depth feedback as to why you got what you did, well, that's an open question. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. There are games that do that. And one of the games I actually cut my teeth on over 30 some years ago is I.O. Holdridge's TAC Ops. And I used to use that game quite a bit when I was a Battalion S2 to teach my my section of, well, what does Soviet and Russian military tactics look like, and how do they fight? I wasn't so much worried about the outcome. I wanted them to my captive audience, because I was their raider, to basically learn something about the doctrine of our perceived adversaries at the time.
Yeah, the rest of us just spent too much money on micro armor instead of TAC Ops.
Hey, all you can eat.
And what about you? Have you seen something similar? Have you done enough with the digital tools to run across something like that, or have you had completely different experiences?
No, I've seen some of the same thing, and it's a perpetual challenge. Harkening back to like my first couple of years at Marine Corps University, before the Wargaming Cloud came on board, which I do want to talk about briefly. But we had some standalone computer systems. We had some standalone copies of Command, and we also ran a wargame tournament based off of DARPA Proteus, which has a different name now. It's the software that's going to be used at the Neller Center for Wargaming. But anyway, DARPA provided all of the computers and the software for that. We just ran it for them. That was another Dr. Ben Jensen special event too, as well. But yeah, the learning the user interface is a requirement to be able to operate the games properly for the learning insights that the students are trying to get. And there's no shortcut. You have to learn it. And unfortunately, given you have like a fixed amount of time in a professional military education curriculum, asking students or faculty to take the hours, or in some cases the weeks, like the command. I went to a command course in England, and I did 3 weeks of self-training during COVID to run an event that Dr. Jensen was helping with Training Education Command, to learn how to run the game, just to run the game, to be able to run the scenario they wanted to do. That's a big time commitment. Which is why, I talked about my go-to war game is Littoral Commander, right? I don't need the user interface is very simple. I don't need to teach you clickology for Littoral Commander. I just got to tell you, there's 4 things you do in every single turn. These are the combinations. Go, right? However, they're like, computer games can do things that tabletop games can't, especially when it comes to both volume of data that it can manage, as well as the different things that it can simulate within the game system, right? Littoral Commander you cross the boundary between playability and realism. And if you trend toward the realism thing on tabletop games, that's where you get, the monster games is really thick rule books and thousands of counters, which may be realistic, but I can't use that in a professional military educational environment, nor can I sell that to the fleet, right? To the operating forces. When you have fixed time with your TEEP, with your deployment workup cycle, with your maintenance requirements and inspection requirements. If I handed you something just short of campaign for North Africa and said you should do this for wargaming for professional development, I'd be either laughed at or kicked out or both, and the commander would be right to do that, because that is not a reasonable ask with the time they have. However, because of the value the computer games offer, the thing that I think the Marine Corps Wargaming Cloud opens potentials to mitigate some of that overhead that's required, because now in the cloud, you, the individual, can learn those games asynchronously on your own time. And then when it comes time for game time for the actual event, you've already done that learning, so you don't have to fight through the interface. You can get to the strategy of the game. And for those listeners not familiar, a couple years back, again, Marine Corps University is part of the larger wargaming across the Marine Corps effort. Got a bucket of money to build a digital cloud-based game system that had a bunch of commercial computer game licenses in there that were accessible to anybody with a login to get to it, which had data tracking so you could track your performance in the games, and which is accessible, and arguably the most key thing, accessible. It's platform agnostic. You can access it on personal network computers, military computers, and this gets back to an aspiration that General Charles Krulak, Commandant of the Marine Corps in 1997, had when he wrote a Marine Corps order that said, I want you to play commercial games on your government computers because I think it's that important to do that. And you can't do that on modern military computers because of all the security requirements and such. Like it would for listeners who may be familiar with Marine Doom, it was a modification of the Doom first-person shooter game engine, had some Marine Corps uniforms and equipment, and it was authorized for use on government computers. But back in 1997, security requirements were so much lower. The requirements now are so high that you simply cannot take a disk of Command Modern Operations and install it on a government computer. You definitely can't log into Steam to run a network-based game of Command Modern Operations. But because the Marine Corps cloud went through all of the secure software security IT requirements, you can use those games on those systems, which one, that is a huge win for proliferating wargaming across the Marine Corps, because you don't have to ask units or individuals to buy new hardware or software. Marine Corps has already bought and paid for it. You just need to log in to access the virtual machines to play the games. And second is that overhead of learning the game user interface, you still can't shortcut that, but now you can do that on sort of more your own timeline when it works for you, so that, again, when it comes game day, all right, I want to run a company level competition using we'll use the Hex War Company Commander game that's in there. You can do all of that learning on your own time beforehand so that you're not fighting through the interface when it comes time to do it. And then, oh, by the way, the cloud allows you to track your performance over time, so you can see your wins, your losses, who they're against, and track trends so that you can use it as a professional development tool. And additionally, you can also assign it as homework, right? And then see how the student did, their performance grade on the game afterwards. So it's something that I hope sustains the resourcing that it's gotten, because it is to my knowledge, it's a unique thing on military networks to be able to use access commercial games in that fashion. And I'm glad you mentioned the Wall Street Journal article, because it gave a shout out to Tim Barrack for the work he's done with Command, yes, but also he's the overseer of the Marine Corps Wargaming Cloud. And if we're going to get wargaming to stick and be used as an institutional professional development tool, that cloud is a huge, awesome resource to be able to access. Because computer games, it can do some things that tabletop games just can't. And now you have the option to do both. And you have removed the overhead, the burden of having to get new computer hardware and software to do it.
Yeah, it also has the added benefit is that the cloud has got a common interface. You pretty much match an interface for one game. You pretty much got it down for the rest of the games that are in that series. I am a huge fan of the Marine Cloud wargame cloud that they developed.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's a whole separate show of sort of how do you make wargaming stick in the military. That's an entirely separate show that unfortunately we're not going to have time for. We're at 90 minutes of recording time. Again, we're going to save some, just editing me mumbling through a couple of things here. But I do want to go ahead and start wrapping us up, in part because I don't want to overtax the audience, but in part because I know we've got limits for us tonight, with other things we've got going on away from the podcast recording. So I'll just throw it out for sort of a final thought, a bit of a wrap up on, hobby games and being able to use them for professional military practices. 90 seconds, Mike, go. Nah, you got more 90 seconds, but as kind of a closing thought here.
Play more games. It's how you become proficient in the profession of arms. It's how you basically develop that understanding about what you can do and what your opponent can do to you.
Yeah. Ian, what do you think? Parting thoughts here.
I think you should do it. I think a little soapbox of mine has been military leaders always pride themselves on, we're decisive decision makers in the moment. We will snap our fingers and make magically the right decision. You don't become a decision maker without developing a habit pattern of making decisions. And if we're all being honest with ourselves, the number of day-to-day military-based decisions your leaders make is not high. Right. There's a lot of administrative decisions, maybe some personnel decisions, but military decisions of, maneuver, firepower, logistical support. You are not challenged to do that a lot on a day-to-day basis. Wargaming can make up that deficit, because within a 2-hour war game, you can make 6 months worth of military decisions you would do in real time. So that when that decisive moment comes, when you have to be that decisive military decision maker, you have built that habit pattern of making decisions, because the war games have helped you close that gap. And final point is I get that everybody's got time limits, resource limits. But to be perfectly blunt, there are war games out there that don't take a lot of time to do. There are war games out there that are not resource intensive. I talked about my $30 card game. I talked about the free to the military Marine Corps Wargaming Cloud. You're out of excuses if you think that lots of time and lots of money is what it takes to do wargaming. It does not require it. It just requires your willingness to accept it as a useful tool to enhance military decision-making, military planning. But don't give me the excuse that it costs too much or takes too much time, because that's bullshit.
Amen.
Amen.
I'm not sure we have a better closing statement than that. So, audience, thank y'all for joining us. Ian, Mike, thank you guys both for being here and offering your thoughts and some of your, hard-earned experience out there doing this for real. So definitely appreciate that. Guys, we're winding up season 13. We've got, 4 or 5 episodes left to go as we wrap this up. We are going to talk to the folks from SD HistCon, the participants, not the organizers, after they come back from SD Hist. We're also going to go back to the Best of Computer Wargaming. We've got some more to talk about there. And we're also going to go back to some 4X space games, because there's been some interesting DLCs that have dropped for a couple of those. And so we've got some Dragoons who have been playing with some of them going to come on and tell us about sort of the latest and greatest in that space as well. In the meantime, as we work our way towards our normal holiday break, keep an eye out for information on January's ACDC as we start to develop the full plans for our digital convention, which is over MLK weekend. And then also start looking for information about Connections Online, which is the stuff that ties in with what we've been talking about tonight on the professional side. That'll be held in early April, where we'll have a week-long conference on professional military wargaming topics. In the meantime, we appreciate you being here. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mention and Dispatches.